Hello there. It is Bears game day, so I'm getting pretty excited about that. Before that starts, though, I have to talk about leprosy a little bit. um, I think I'm mainly going to focus on the medieval part of the Watts chapter. It, of course, talks about the medieval part and contrasts it with British India. Uh, and in general, I think he, has some good and some important things to say. I'm not going to deal with the medical details because hopefully you've already watched that video. How does leprosy damage the body? Um, it's I think it's good, and although she goes off the rails, I think in the last 30 seconds or so, and starts speculating about Byzantine history in a way I think that Watts would not approve of. So, maybe stick to your field of microbiology, okay? you know. Um, anyway, but I think that's pretty good. So you can take a look at that, or you can go to this the website for the CDC, and it has a good section on leprosy. Um, I also found some material on a website from leprosy missions. Um, there's several things about leprosy I find really interesting, both historically and today. The today part is almost every disease seems to have an organization. Obviously, American Cancer Society, American Lung Association, pancreatic cancer, breast cancer, um, uh, liver disease, whatever, uh, there's no organization for leprosy. And it's kind of odd to me. And I don't know if that's just because it's primarily, not exclusively, but primarily in the developing world. I don't know. Uh, but it's almost as if the, you know, ancient and medieval stigma of leprosy has continued on. Anyway, so I'm going to use the term leprosy mostly because that's what Watts uses, and we don't want to be getting too confusing here. A lot of times nowadays you'll hear the term Hansen's disease, named after Dr. Hansen, who identified the causative organism, or at least the first one to see it under a microscope in the latter part of the 19th century. Um, but that hasn't really caught on much. I mean, it's kind of like ALS, okay? Amyotrophic lateral sclerosis. Yeah, it's a mouthful. It used to be known as Lou Gehrig's disease, and they're trying to get away from that. I don't know. I don't think Lou minds, but um, so they talk about kind of rebranding themselves as rebranding the disease as ALS. The rebrand from leprosy to Hansen's disease hasn't been as effective from what I can observe. I mean, people still talk about leprosy and talk about lepers. Although from the Leprosy Mission website, it says this down here. Is it okay to use the word leper? And they say no, because of the stigma that it means an outcast and person suffering from the disease faces becoming ostracized. And I get that. I mean, a lot of disease. I guess that's another thing I find interesting about leprosy. It's hard. I'm going to pause for 30 seconds here. Can you think of another disease where you have a name of the disease and then you have a specific name for someone afflicted with that disease? I'm waiting. Uh, the way that we have leprosy and leper. I mean, we don't talk about people with cancer as, canceritic or whatever, right? I don't know, the closest I can come historically, and it's not really used nowadays, is at least through the 19th century, they would talk about syphilitics, people with syphilis. And I wonder if it's not similar to leprosy. Well, we'll talk in just a minute about maybe there's connections between those two. Um, but advanced syphilis is primarily a skin condition. It was treated by dermatologists. And in both cases, then, it's a very noticeable and oftentimes disfiguring skin condition. which I think adds to kind of the horror that people see when they think about leprosy. Even though, as you know from the medical details, if you take a look, it's not easily contagious and so on. Anyway, but I was thinking about also like the whole idea of stigma and like Trump renaming COVID the China virus or something, the Chinese virus or Chinese disease and so on. Something that typically, once again, we don't tend to do, as we'll see later in this semester. Number of diseases emerged in the United States in the later part of the 20th century, and people in the other part of the world don't call those American diseases. So anyway, there is definitely, though, this issue about stigma with disease, and especially with leprosy. By the way, another helpful tip from the folks at the Leprosy Mission website here. Can people get leprosy from armadillos? The answer is yes. Okay. Now, they didn't specify what you're doing with the armadillo to get leprosy. And I know we're all about inclusion these days, but if you're thinking about inviting armadillos to your Halloween party or something, maybe rethink that. All right. Just a helpful tip. Okay, let's move on here. I wanted to explain something that Watts does talk about a little bit. He talks about quite a bit, but he doesn't really explain it. He talks about disease as a social construct, and he talks about leprosy versus the leprosy construct. And what he's saying there is he's trying to draw a distinction between leprosy, real leprosy, okay, caused with the Mycobacterium leprae, causative organism, the disease progression that science recognizes, and so on. He's trying to draw a distinction between that and kind of the social perception of leprosy, as it were, okay? Because he argues that through medieval Europe, a lot of what was being identified as leprosy probably wasn't strictly leprosy. Right? So that's why he calls it construct leprosy. It's either other diseases grouped together, and so on. But also, the idea of a construct largely comes from postmodern, post-structuralist French philosophy, and especially Michel Foucault, who wrote about disease. Watts makes reference to him a few times, and Foucault's big thing was saying that disease isn't just causative organism, symptoms, prognosis, diagnosis, that sort of thing, just the medical side. It's the social cultural construct around it. Okay, it's essentially what you think and feel about the disease is really what the disease is. And that's what Watts is saying here. And we can see that with other diseases, at least in my lifetime, probably not yours so much, but with the emergence of AIDS, where everyone was in an uproar about AIDS, and they don't want to touch somebody with AIDS, and they're afraid of getting it. And it was this huge kind of breakthrough moment when Princess Diana shook hands with an AIDS patient, and then she died in a car accident. No, I'm just kidding. And so there was a social construct around AIDS and what it was that didn't really match up with the medical aspect of the disease. And these constructs, of course, are born largely out of ignorance and fear, right? I mean, that's what we had, and I think that's what we see with leprosy. The idea of leprosaria and these places that you shut these people away so they're not infecting the rest of society. Then he makes it, I think, also important points of drawing distinctions between that and treatment of Jewish people, right? Seeing the other as a threat and also to be ostracized. It's not much of a stretch. I mean, we saw that once again with COVID, right? It was already here, and they're like shutting down, flights from China. Guess what? Not going to do any good. Anyway, so that's what he's talking about there. As I said, in general, I think the Watts chapter is pretty good. I would say that I'm normally swayed by archaeological evidence, but in this case, I have to question it a little bit. And that's because of the reading we did on the Holiday and Poole article. Okay, just to remind you, their main argument is, that plague of Athens really can't be identified because it's very likely whatever it was has mutated, right? So when Thucydides gives us all these symptoms and so on, and nothing matches a contemporary disease, because the disease probably has changed. So I'm wondering also about leprosy, because Watts makes the point that looking at archaeological remains from cemeteries prior to the 13th century, you don't find the bodily changes that you would expect from leprosy in these victims. So maybe because of that, that's evidence that it's not true leprosy, or maybe it's evidence that it is leprosy, but it was a different type, and it has changed since then. Okay, it is also possible that leprosy nowadays is not highly contagious. Maybe that wasn't the case back then. Maybe they were right to be, afraid of contagion much more than we are. I don't know, but it's an interesting point, and I think about that Holiday and Poole chapter a lot, and I think it has a lot of good ideas. So there's no doubt also that the medieval, experts, quote unquote, on leprosy were less than precise, I think, in their descriptions of the disease and the causes. I think part of that goes back to, origins of Christianity and connections between Christianity and leprosy, right? You see leprosy in the Bible, and I got some links here. Various topics that are talked about. Although, keep in mind what Watts says about the translation of the term leper in the Bible. And if you go back and look, and of course the Bible is a translation, sometimes through 2 or 3 languages. So, but if you go back and look at the original term, it's probably not one we would translate as leprosy or leper. So, we have to keep that in mind. But even so, Christianity does have this identification with leprosy as being a distinct problem at the time. And then you have the, Jesus healing or cleansing a leper is an important story. It's an important parable in the Bible, especially in the book of Matthew. And you can kind of see here's a this is probably a Renaissance artwork depicting this. Although Jesus kind of looks like what's the name of the actor, Hemsworth, who plays Thor. It kind of looks like Hemsworth there. I don't know, or me in the 1970s. And there's a suspicious number of blondes in this painting, which should be from somewhere in the Eastern Mediterranean. Anyway, okay, so that's what we have. We got the supplicant. Sick person here who's in, the shrouds, and, we're not seeing deformed or anything, but you're seeing very pale, certainly compared to like the strong guy behind him here who's kind of, I don't know what he's doing. Is he kind of holding him up? I'm not sure. Yeah, I think he is. Anyway, so that's, certainly an important lesson in Christianity, and I think because of that, well, that's really one of the points of origin of the whole idea of Christ as a healer, which then becomes a significant cultural part of Christianity, where you have the identification of the religion and healing, and of course the hospitals, right? And priests and nuns as healers, because they're following in the example of Christ. And that's what you see then in Watts, once again, with those leprosaria being opened primarily by Catholic organizations and so on. Yeah. So it is an interesting one, but of course, when you're talking about any religion, but especially in this case, actually Christianity and disease, you can't get away from the issue of morality. That is also an aspect of it. And then, frankly, looking at this, especially in the medieval period, we got to go back to Galen. Okay, you thought we were done with Galen? We're not. Galen's influence continues on. All right. And, once again, he's wrong. But okay. But there was in the medieval period the belief that there were 4 types of leprosy. Why 4? Well, because for the 4 humors, of course. And once again, the 4 humors are these fluids in the body, and when they get out of balance, that's what causes illness. According to Galen. Well, and the way to heal someone is to bring those fluids back into balance, either by draining off excess or supporting the production of more if it's low. Okay. But this is also one of the reasons where we have the connection between leprosy and sex. If you remember from Watts, patients who are entering the leprosaria had to vow to abstain from sex, even with their spouses. Well, why is that? Well, because according to Galen or humoral teaching, sex has a cooling and drying effect on the body. I'm not going to comment further, okay? But I don't think he's right. Leprosy also has the same effect. Leprosy, they thought, leaves the patient cooler and drier. Remember, it's cool, warm, wet, dry. Everything is on these continuums. Anyway, so sex is bad because it exacerbates the condition that leprosy already causes. So that's why patients were supposed to abstain from sex. So, but then you obviously clearly also had this connection with Christianity and morality about sex. Another thing that Watts talks about is the social political issue about it's about power in society, right? And in this case, who's going to have the power to determine who is a leper? And this is where he starts talking about setting up these boards, right? And the supposed leper can pick one person, and then there are other 2 assigned. But who are these people going to be? Are they priests? Are they magistrates? Or are they, university-trained doctors? And, of course, what we're seeing here also is the growth of the medical profession, right? And so they are arguing for the right to control this process. Whereas, on the other hand, priests in the church are also arguing for their right to influence or control the process. Anyway, so this becomes such an issue, though, but by the 13th century, the doctors write up guidebooks, which are basically questionnaires to ask people to determine if what they have is leprosy. And as Watts tells you, a number of times people will go before these boards and it'll be determined that they don't have leprosy. Well, how did they determine that? Of course, they're not doing lab tests or whatever else. They're asking them a series of questions. And what are those questions? Well, I got a few of them here. Has the person lain with a leprous man or woman? Okay. Has he, assuming a male, had intercourse with a menstruating woman? That was thought to cause leprosy, not only in the man, but also in, if she were to get pregnant, perhaps in her child. Okay, does the person desire venery more than is usual? So in other words, they desire sex more than is usual? Do they burn in coitus? Okay, that sounds like gonorrhea to me. And felt weaker than usual after intercourse. Okay, so does sex leave them tired? Do they have a burning feeling? Do they have, sexual desires? Do they exhibit melancholy, bad and crafty habits? Lepers show bad habits and violence, for they are easily angered and not quickly calmed, and they do not trust anyone. And finally, they exhibit sadness, deceit, and anxiety. All right. Well, there's a book that actually goes through these and kind of takes these apart and so on. But I think it's pretty easy to see in a number of these, once again, the connection between the, well, I'll go with Watts here, the construct leprosy and ideas about morality, right? Two possible reasons for that. One is, of course, this is coming out of this Christian idea. And it's important to point out, as Watts does, you don't see this in Islam. Okay? Islam doesn't really assign morality to leprosy. They see it kind of more as the medical leprosy, as this skin disease, which is hard to get and slow to develop, and you could survive with for decades, right? So it's the construct of leprosy, especially in Christian and medieval Europe, that sees it with this issue of morality. Now, is it only because of the Christian identification and, of course, religion and morality? Or is it because Europe is also mixing this up with maybe some sort of STD? What they see as leprosy might possibly be a form of syphilis. Okay? Certainly a number of these things you see on here, right? Do you burn in coitus? Well, that's a STD there. Weaker than usual after intercourse, and so on. The bad and crafty habits, bad habits, violence, easily angered. Sadness, anxiety. Any of those things could apply to someone who's, of course, has a chronic illness. I got chronic pain myself, and I'm easily angered. Okay. Anyway, so we'll talk about this some more when we get to, I think it's 2 weeks from now, when we start talking about syphilis and its introduction to Europe. Was it introduced? Was it endemic? And so on, and try to pick apart some of this a little more. Anyway, okay, I think that's all I have. Yep, that's what I wanted to say about Watts and leprosy. So have a good week, and I say go Bears. By the time you watch this, we'll know how they did.